Here we go.
Welcome. I'm Catherine Harris, the Post-Permanency Manager for DCF Family Services and the coordinator for the Vermont Consortium for Adoption and Guardianship. I'm also an adoptive parent and birth parent as well. During this recording, you may hear some background noises as we are all recording from home, so please just keep your focus on the PowerPoint, what we're saying, rather than what you might be hearing in the background. The purpose of this PowerPoint is to give you an overview of the 7 core issues in adoption. And these are also pertinent to guardianship families and also apply to foster children and foster families and the families that those children were removed from. The framework that we're going to be discussing was developed in the early 1980s by Deborah Silverstein and Sharon Kaplan-Rosia. This has continued to be a useful framework for thinking about the normal issues that all members of the adoption constellation experience during their lives. This framework can assist us in understanding and supporting the children, the parents, and the birth parents. When we refer to the adoption constellation, that's who we're talking about: the child, youth, or adult who joined their family through adoption, their birth parents, and their adoptive parents, all of whom experience these 7 core issues. With me for this presentation is Amy Bilowski-Branch. Would you mind introducing yourself, Amy?
Thanks, Catherine. Great to be here. I'm Amy. I'm a training specialist at the Vermont Child Welfare Training Partnership, and I'm also the adoptive mother of 2 young adult children. Also with us is Janet Benoit Connor. Janet.
Hello. Yes, I'm Janet Benoit Connor. I am a trainer for the consortium. Retired from the UVM Child Welfare Training Partnership, where I was a training specialist as well. I am a birth parent of 3 and the adoptive parent of 2 young women, and happy to be with you today.
So this slide provides an overview of the 7 core issues: loss and grief, abandonment and rejection, shame and guilt, intimacy and trust, loyalty, identity, and control and mastery. The timeline at the bottom is a reminder that these happen over our lifetimes. They can intensify, resolve, and then later return for our next level of work. For example, with loss and grief, which is at the hub or center of the 7 core issues, this can be experienced as waves that come and go. There's that initial loss of as a child of having separated from birth family. Later, as you're coming to physical maturity, you may be grieving that your birth parents aren't able to see who you are as an emerging adult. And then later, if you birth a child yourself, you may once again experience that loss and that grief from that early separation that you experienced. The rim that's illustrated here is secrecy and denial, and that represents the role that these can play in preventing individuals from being able to find healthy ways through these issues. If it isn't safe to talk about your adoption journey, it can be impossible to work through these normal issues. The role that secrecy plays can be damaging to each member of the constellation. So it's imperative to have open and honest conversations about adoption to make sure that children are able to ask their questions, know their stories, and have a coherent narrative, which is understanding what happened to them when they were born, where they were when they were 4 years old, what happened when they were 13, and so on. This is a foundation for healthy individuals. Now we're going to talk about each of the core issues in more detail. Janet's going to start us off with loss and grief.
Thanks, Catherine. As Catherine mentioned, loss and grief are at the core of every adoption. Without loss, an adoption doesn't occur. Loss and grief impact all members of the adoption constellation, and as Catherine mentioned, will ebb and flow throughout a person's life. In the school system, for example, this may be triggered by special events such as a Mother's or Father's Day, self-portraits, family tree exercises, books about families, loss of their favorite teacher or classmate if they move away, or perhaps the favorite teacher goes on maternity leave. Children are keenly aware of their losses, if not always cognitively, but physically as well. Sometimes children will be crying for seemingly no reason, or acting out, or clinging to objects. For children of color in a predominantly white state such as Vermont, their loss of others that look like them can be particularly hard to manage. They might ask themselves questions such as, where do I fit in? They may, or how can I share my feelings with others who don't look like me or who have families that they do look like? Within kinship families, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and children all feel the loss of birth parents and grieve the loss of what might have been. loss of their freedom that's expected when we get older and our own children are grown, etc. Grief can take many forms, and it is important to always observe the behavior of our children in terms of what might be the underlying reason for this behavior. For example, transitions throughout the day could be particularly difficult. Just leaving children at school or any change in their schedule can just seemingly cause more difficulty for them than for children that may not have been adopted. After loss and grief, the second core issue that I'll be discussing is abandonment and rejection. Children who were adopted feel that they have been abandoned. And as a result of that, children who were adopted often will push people away, even when they need them the most. They can easily miss cues and misread nonverbal behavior and feel that they are being judged and judge others quickly. This impacts how they relate to others, both at home and in school. Because they may feel that they have been abandoned and rejected, they work very hard to keep others at a distance in order to protect their emotions. Better for them to reject others than to be rejected. For example, they may not willingly try out for a team sport or a part in a play or join a circle in preschool or early grades for fear that they may not be accepted or be good enough. They will cling to friends they do have very tightly until they sense any kind of tension in this relationship, and then they will possibly push them away. Feedback is particularly hard for these children to hear as they can't separate who they are from the activity or instruction that is being given. They take feedback very personally. Peer conflicts they can struggle with as well. They can take an ugly turn very quickly as these children often cannot regulate their emotions and again, take any kind of conflict personally. They may act out or turn into themselves and not share what is happening. Often their friendships will be with others a few years younger than them, for this is a safe place where they can feel valued and value others without judgment. Children of color and children within kinship families are particularly vulnerable to abandonment and rejection as they already feel different from their peers. Now, Amy will continue with another core issue of adoption, shame and guilt, and then intimacy and trust. Amy?
When young children experience loss or grief, abandonment or rejection, they typically blame themselves. They can find no other explanation for having their birth parents leave them or abuse or neglect them. This causes deep shame. Shame and guilt are similar but different. Guilt is that sense you have done something wrong. Hopefully, the guilty feeling motivates you to repair and change your behavior. Children who join their families through adoption can feel guilty more frequently and about more things than other children, even for things that might not actually be their fault. Shame is that deep-seated feeling that something is incredibly wrong with you as a person. Most of us have felt it from time to time, and it can be debilitating. Imagine having that feeling most of the time. Children of adoption frequently feel shame. Other members of the adoption constellation can feel shame too. Birth parents who harmed or relinquished or had their children taken from them. Adopted parents may share some shame about infertility or a conflictual relationship with the birth parents or tough decisions they've had to make as adoptive parents. A child who has underlying guilt or shame may struggle at school or home through lack of confidence, overly apologizing, or conversely, never apologizing, blaming others to avoid feeling self-shame, not sticking up for themselves, overly defensive, avoidant, or pushing away. Children or youth of color may share the additional burden of shame or guilt related to the color of their skin, especially if they've been teased, bullied, or harassed because of their race. If they are children of color being raised by white parents or other white family members, their feelings of shame could be magnified due to always being in the spotlight. Everybody knows you are different from your family, and everyone knows you were adopted. You can't blend in. A tough spot for someone who is struggling with shame. In kinship families, shame and guilt can be compounded due to the family's feelings about what led to the adoption. Substance abuse, domestic violence, other abuse, mental illness. In these situations, all members of the adoption constellation may all share the same feelings of shame. Developing a sense of pride, accomplishment, and competency can counteract the impact of shame and guilt. Support children to develop their natural talents and skills. Avoid joking about any personal attributes. Make sure to separate their behaviors from who they are. Avoid comparing them to other children. Intimacy and trust is another one of the 7 core issues. And the reason that this one is a core issue for children who were adopted is that their very first relationship with their birth parents was severed. In an ideal world, children would stay with the people who conceived and birthed them. But because that didn't happen, even sometimes for very good reasons, children are left wondering whether or not they will lose this next relationship. Can they trust their new parents? Is it safe to get close? This is especially challenging for children who have a history of multiple placements. Birth parents may develop mistrust if they feel as though the system did not treat them well. Adoptive parents may be cautious or worried about getting close to their child if they have a history of miscarriage or infertility or other previous adoptions that didn't work out. At home, children may present as cautious or avoidant in their family relationships. Or the reverse may be true. They too quickly become intimate with people that they may or may not be trustworthy. They might continually test their parents to make sure they won't leave them. At school, these children might not have any or very few friends. They might test their teachers to see if the teacher is worthy of their trust. Or they could have poor boundaries, seemingly trusting everyone. As they get older, these youth may struggle with romantic or sexual relationships, wanting intimate and trusting relationships, but not always knowing how to do this in a healthy way. Children of color could have additional intimacy or trust issues if their sense of trust has been violated through racism or microaggressions, especially if they are a minority in a mostly white population. They may struggle due to lack of information regarding ethnic, language, or culture. They may lack positive or even any experiences with people who look like them. In kinship adoptions, there may be layers of trust and mistrust issues if some family members have kept secrets or told lies, or broken trust due to substance abuse, criminal activity, or mental health challenges. Sometimes trust is damaged because family members may have very different opinions about where a child should live or whether they should be adopted by a particular family member. Intimacy and trust issues can be improved through creating trusting relationships. When working with a child or youth who has these issues, make sure that you never make a promise that you can't keep. Create safe relationships with them where they can talk about their thoughts and feelings. Provide examples and information about healthy relationships. Validate them and take their concerns seriously when they share something personal with you. Don't take it personally if it takes a long time for them to trust you. Be patient, as the rewards will be priceless. Next, we'll talk about loyalty.
Children who are adopted can struggle with feeling mixed loyalties. They're always going to belong to 2 families, their birth family and their family through adoption. And as you can imagine, this results in their needing to work through who are they supposed to love and who should they feel loyalty towards. It's during the middle school ages that loyalty can start to intensify as an issue. And not that it won't continue, may not have turned up earlier, but that middle school time, they're starting to think about who do they look like, where do they come from, where do they belong? And during this process, they're also trying to come to terms with loving 2 sets of parents, and whether it's a betrayal of their adoptive parents, if they're loving their birth parents, or is it a betrayal of the birth parents if they love their adoptive parents? This can feel like an emotional tug of war, as one day your child just wants to be with you, won't leave your side, and the next they want nothing to do with you. In the school setting, children may appear to be overly loyal to their friends, believing that there's nothing that friend can ever do wrong, or they may be struggling with having friends in different groups and not understanding how to negotiate between those groups. In kinship families, children working through loyalty issues may question their relative's role as their parent, and the grandparent, who's now the parent, may struggle with choosing between their son or daughter and how to support them while at the same time being the parent of their grandchild and having to protect them. In transracial and transcultural families, you'll see many of the same struggles as other adopted children and parents experience, with the addition of having to negotiate loyalty issues regarding their culture of birth. Where do they belong? And how do they express themselves? If they decide, if it's a Black child and they decide that they want to really just present as a very Black person, are they going to feel, they may struggle with betraying their adoptive family and what that culture has been. On the other hand, if they function within that adoptive family's culture, are they betraying the culture of their birth? Helping children understand that they can belong to multiple cultures at once is important, and giving them permission to love their birth family as well as their adoptive family will help support them working through their loyalty issues. Next, we have next we have identity, and how complicated understanding who you are and where you belong can be for a child who joined their family through adoption. Not only do they need to develop their understanding of who they are as a person, but who they are as an adopted person. For adoptive parents, you're also working on your identity. Being a birth parent is different than being an adoptive parent. You didn't come to forming your family in the same way. And what does that mean regarding who you are as an individual, as a parent, and who you are as a family? For kinship families, you're going to have to reformulate their identity. They're going to need to move from being grandparent to being grandparent and parent. What does that mean? Who are you when you have both of those roles? It's critical that children have all the key details of their history by the time they're becoming an adolescent, so they have an accurate understanding of how and why they joined their adopted family, what culture or cultures they were born into, and what their genetic history entails. Adult adoptees, reflecting back on this period, often report having felt that a part of their identity was missing. Providing them as much information as you have is going to help them fill in those gaps. Teachers may observe youth isolating themselves, not feeling that they belong anymore, or finding a sense of belonging by attaching to a group, whether or not it's a positive or a negative group. For the transracial child or youth, how others respond to them or how people of color are represented in the media can create deep challenges with their development of a positive self-image. Providing consistent positive role models, images, and literature can help to balance this. Working towards becoming a multicultural family and encouraging the school to surround all of the students with positive representations of people and cultures from around the world can help everyone. Our next core issue is mastery and control. And Amy, you want to take that one?
Sure, thanks, Catherine. Children or youth who join their family through adoption can feel powerless or like they have no control over their lives, starting with the fact that they had no say in the decision that completely changed their life trajectory. It can feel like everything else is out of their control. Birth parents can have similar feelings of powerlessness as their lives were also significantly altered, frequently with not as much control as they would have preferred. For adoptive parents, sometimes they hear about a child 24 hours before placement, or they might wait 4, 5, or more years for a child to join their family. The adoption process is filled with things that are out of an individual or a family's control. These feelings of powerlessness and lack of control can lead children or youth to frequently engage in power struggles or try to take control away from adults or authority figures at both home and school. If they experienced abuse or neglect, these attempts at gaining power and control may be even more intense. They may easily get into fights or refuse to follow even simple directions. They may insist on doing things their way. Some children will attempt to gain control in overt ways, while others may be more subtle. This could cause conflict with peers or lead to other peers avoiding them. Children of color may especially feel powerless or a sense of lack of control, especially if they do not have many opportunities to be with people who share their culture or who look like them. As they become more aware of societal racial power imbalances, they may strive to right wrongs or become overwhelmed and depressed. In kinship adoption situations, caregivers may feel at the mercy of the courts or of the birth parents as plans change again and again and again over the course of many years. Their sense of powerlessness and lack of control can be palpable. For any of us, the antidote to powerlessness or lack of control is mastery. Finding ways to support and encourage children to achieve competence and mastery is incredibly helpful. Giving them choice and responsibility can also be very helpful. Each of the 7 core issues in adoption impact all members of the adoption constellation across the lifespan. Not directly referenced in the 7 core issues are attachment and trauma. Many children experience developmental trauma prior to joining their families through adoption and guardianship. This trauma can be a contributing factor to the attachment challenges that some children experience. Healing about all of this can feel overwhelming, but it is important to know that the purpose of understanding these issues is not to cause concern or hopelessness. Rather, the purpose in sharing these 7 core issues with you is to support the adults who love, care for, and work with the children of adoption to better understand their emotions and behaviors, and to develop more effective strategies for engagement, teaching, intervention, growth, and healing. If you would like more information about the 7 core issues, please consider the following resources: the Vermont Consortium for Adoption and Guardianship, and the Vermont Child Welfare Training Partnership. On behalf of myself, Catherine, and Janet, we want to thank you for being a part of this training today.